Welcome to this video about wildfire mitigation. My name is Vince Plymell, Assistant Commissioner of Insurance for the state of Colorado. We've invited some of Colorado's experts on wildfire mitigation to talk to you about what it is and its importance to homeowners and all Coloradans. But first, I'd like to introduce Colorado's Insurance Commissioner, Michael Conway, to kick things off.
Thanks, Vince. As Vince said, my name is Mike Conway. I'm the Insurance Commissioner for the state of Colorado, and we're here to talk about wildfire mitigation, why it's important, and how to do it. And I'm going to start with that why it's important question to help frame things today. So as we sit here and we record this video, it's September 16th, 2020. The first and the fifth biggest wildfires in Colorado's history are burning as we record this video. The first, the biggest fire in Colorado's recorded history, the Pine Gulch fire, is burning outside of Grand Junction, Colorado at nearly 140,000 acres. The Cameron Peak fire, the fifth biggest fire in Colorado's history, is burning outside of Fort Collins at nearly 103,000 acres. Those are the first and the fifth biggest fires in Colorado's history, but all top 10 biggest fires in Colorado's history have burned from 2002 through to today. And the top 5 in Colorado's recorded history have burned from 2013 through today. And it's because of that the governor made the fight against climate change one of his top 4 bold priorities for his administration. And it's that fight. That fight is going to take decades. And as we fight that fight, it's going to be imperative for us to protect property and lives to the greatest extent possible with any and every tool that we have. And wildfire mitigation is one of those tools. And it's an important tool that can do just that, protect both lives and property. And to start the conversation today, we're going to have Mike Lester talk to us about the wildland-urban interface, also known as the WUI, and the importance of the WUI and the importance of fire mitigation in the WUI. Mike, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. My name is Mike Lester. I'm the Director of the Colorado State Forest Service. And we have a few things to talk to you about wildland-urban interface and about wildfire mitigation. So what is the wildland-urban interface? Well, it's any location where human improvements exist with natural vegetation. And the WUI, which we call the wildland-urban interface, includes more than homes in the forest. It's any wildland fuels, like subdivisions within shrubs or grasslands that can be damaged or lost during a wildfire. So it may be a broader category than you might have heard. Nearly half of Colorado's total population lives within the WUI, or wildland-urban interface. That's 2.9 million plus residents. And the trend of residents moving into the WUI does continue. And you can see from this screenshot of Jefferson County, and you can see the wildfire risk illustrated here. Anyone at risk from wildfire should become aware of their level of risk, and we have some tools that can help. The Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment is an online mapping tool that provides access to statewide wildfire risk information, and it is now housed in the Colorado Forest Atlas. This tool provides a great starting point for users to develop awareness of the risk where they live. So what is wildfire mitigation? Wildfire mitigation are vegetation treatments and modifications and maintenance of structures to minimize the negative impacts of wildfire. So how do we mitigate this wildfire risk? There's several steps we can take. First, we need to develop risk awareness and promote community cohesion and effort. This is a joint effort. Second, we need to reduce the ignitability of structures. Third, we need to manage the vegetation or fuels to reduce fire behavior. Fourth, we need to support community wildfire protection plans and be sure to ask your county commissioners if you have one in your area. And last, we need to channel funding for these purposes. So who mitigates wildfire risk? Well, the Colorado State Forest Service is the lead state agency in fuels mitigation expertise in Colorado. And we like to think we're an excellent resource for residents who want to gain more information and take steps to decrease the threat of wildfire to their property. But wildfire mitigation cannot be completed by one statewide agency. We rely on partners. One of those partners is the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA. NFPA manages the overall Firewise USA program, and the Colorado State Forest Service manages the program in Colorado. Firewise USA is a useful recognition program that promotes neighborhood wildfire risk reduction through annual education, activity, and investment requirements. Colorado is home to 2 of the original 12 pilot sites from 2002, and both those sites are still active. Colorado is currently tied with Oregon for the second most active sites in the state with 190. NFPA also supports wildfire education efforts in Colorado and nationwide, provides mitigation training and reference materials online, and helps administer a useful funding award program with State Farm Insurance that has had numerous recipients in Colorado over the years. But those aren't our only partners. Other partners whose relationships provide leverage for on-the-ground mitigation and education efforts to move Colorado towards a future with more resilient landscapes and communities better adapted to wildfire. Those partners include, but not exclusively them, are the United States Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain Insurance Information Association, the Colorado Association of Realtors, the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, and the Division of Natural Resources, and other state agencies, numerous non-governmental organizations, county and local governments, conservation districts, local fire agencies, and many of our water utilities, and many more. We appreciate your attention, and I'm going to turn it over to back to Commissioner Conway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was a great and informative discussion and presentation. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Dan Gorham. Dan is a research engineer with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. He's going to talk about that organization's latest research into wildfire mitigation. Dan?
Thanks, all. Again, my name is Daniel Gorham. I am a research engineer with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. IBHS is a nonprofit organization supported by the property insurance and reinsurance industry with the mission to develop science and research to help reduce the loss from natural hazards. We focused on 4 core perils, including wind-driven rain, hail, high wind, and wildfire. And my focus is on wildfire. And so what we'll be talking about here during this presentation is the culmination of more than 10 years of research by our predecessors at IBHS, as well as with partner organizations, looking at how wildfire as a hazard impacts the built environment. And as Mike was talking about, this is often in the WUI, the wildland-urban interface or intermix. But one of the important things to note is that recent disasters across the country and across the world has helped us realize and recognize that the vulnerability to wildfire is not just a cabin in the woods or what we might traditionally think as a forest fire-like area. We're seeing the encroachment of the built environment out into the wildland, and we're seeing fuels change as the climate does that are maybe more receptive to fuels and fire. And so what IBHS has done recently is really leaned into the science and looking at reducing the loss from disasters. And here we've launched Wildfire Ready. And Wildfire Ready is a campaign drive that homeowners, communities, and the insurance industry in understanding how you can change how wildfires ravage suburban neighborhoods. And we do this by addressing components in their vulnerability and a relative risk perspective to help homeowners and business owners make the best decisions to be wildfire resilient. And so again, with the launch of this Wildfire Ready is supported by a technical report, the Suburban Wildfire Adaptation Roadmaps. And this roadmap really provides the basis for the decisions that we made in prioritizing and recommending mitigation strategies. This is, again, based on research and science and evidence from field deployments. And the end result is the decisions and the actions that homeowners can make to have the biggest impact to reducing their risk and vulnerability to wildfire. And this is exactly that, a roadmap. And here we have 4 steps. First is to start here, and these are items that are critical for homeowners to take to reduce their risk. Second, we go on to keep going. Oftentimes these are DIY or projects that you could do on the weekend to, again, continue to reduce your vulnerability. Continuing with level up in the last mile, and these are some items that might cause or might require a little bit more work, but ultimately can, again, buy down your risk and vulnerability to wildfire as a hazard. So first, start here. These are the 4 items that are critical for anyone, any homeowner, or any community member to do to their individual structures to be wildfire resilient. And the first is starting with the roof. The roof is a generally horizontal surface, and we know it's a vulnerability to wildfire and the different ignition mechanisms, including embers and direct flame contact. So we recommend, if you don't already have one, get a Class A rated roof covering. Most asphalt shingles are Class A rated, but in addition to that, you have metal and tile roofs that can be more resistant than other options such as cedar or roof or wood shingles. The next, moving down to the building, is the 5-foot zone at the base of the wall. This is what we call the immediate home ignition zone. This is where those embers that can travel up to a mile ahead of the fire front can land, and if there is debris, whether it be vegetative or structural there, those embers can land and potentially ignite that and cause direct flame contact against the house. So we want to make that 5-foot zone all the way around the perimeter of the structure, including underneath decks, clear of debris, both structural, things that you might have in your yard, think hoses, and vegetative. Again, continuing on, clearing underneath the deck, particularly raised decks, which provide areas potentially for storage. The challenge is that debris can accumulate here, as well as stored items, and that during the event of a fire underneath the deck is a really severe exposure, and that deck attached to the primary structure can be a severe vulnerability. So keeping that underdeck area cleared, especially as wildfire season approaches. And then finally, with the start here, we want to talk about how embers can enter into the home, and that's oftentimes through vents. And so our guidance here is to use fine metal mesh, 1/8 inch or finer, that will reduce the potential and the likelihood of embers entering the home. Next, moving on to keep going. And keep going are, again, things that you can do on your property and with your neighbors. And this is one instance where you may have a fence and your neighbor does. And we recommend having some discussion to talk about how you can have removal of that back-to-back fence. Because what happens is, again, debris will accumulate in between those fences, and if ignited, there's enough fuel there that it can be a more severe exposure to the home. So have a discussion with your neighbor, find options that you could remove one of the fences or come up with an agreeable option that reduces that vulnerability. Also, if you have fences, attaching the immediate section that comes to your home, whether that's the first 8 or 10 feet, replacing that with a non-combustible option like a metal fence. This is so that if that fence does ignite, it's not continuous combustible fuels up until the home. Clearing yard debris, and this is maintaining and creating defensible space. And fuel islands, we're not asking for a barren landscape in your yard, but being thoughtful and following local guidance on how to select and place fuels there. Trimming trees that you do have to reduce that vertical continuity so fire doesn't spread up into the crowns. And where you do have low decks that you may not be storing items under, but could still accumulate debris under, fencing and enclosing them so debris doesn't accumulate. Moving on to level up. This is where we're talking about things that, again, you're doing at your property level and interparcel with your neighbors at a community scale. Outbuildings, whether it be sheds or playgrounds or dog houses, moving them away from the primary structure, because if they do ignite during a wildfire, they become a source of flames and embers to potentially ignite the primary structure, your home. Looking at some of the building components, including the siding, replacing wood siding with a non-combustible option or one that would be more resistant to fire, such as fiber cement board or masonry. And where the roof extends beyond the wall, that would be the eave area, and closing that so if there is a fire on the ground, it is not as likely to get up into that eave area and potentially into the attic. And then again, other building shape features like bay windows and underneath those, enclosing those so neither debris nor fire can get underneath. And finally, going the last mile, we talk about things that you can do either in a retrofit or in a new build, is building with wildfire resistant materials, and particularly with decks. Again, these are structures that are attached to the home and can carry fire directly to it. Some of the other openings like windows and garage doors, upgrading those for windows using multi-pane and more fire resistant materials, and for garage doors, making sure they're entirely sealed so embers can't enter. And then finally, when we think about not just what we do to the structure, but around it, extending that defensible space or that home ignition zone maintenance to be more resilient to when the fire approaches and the embers land. And so all this work is summarized in consumer-facing, homeowner-friendly format, and is available here on disastersafety.org. and just a reminder to be wildfire ready year round. Handing it back to you, Commissioner.
Thanks, Dan. So now we're going to turn to a question and answer with a panel of folks that we've got here today, an expert panel. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to kick into some questions. So I'm going to start with Carol. Carol, can you introduce yourself for folks, please?
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm Carol Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Rocky Mountain Insurance Association. The main goal of our association in representing auto, home, and business insurance companies in Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, and Wyoming is really to get people to think about the unthinkable before it happens. The role we play in wildfire is helping them before, during, and after a wildfire better understand how their insurance works. And then how can we motivate folks to make sure they're protecting their property from wildfire, but also their personal finances.
Thanks, Carol. And to keep things interesting, we have two Dans today, so we're going to let Dan Beveridge introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Commissioner. My name is Daniel Beveridge with the Colorado State Forest Service. I'm the agency's Wildfire Mitigation Program Specialist. I'm the state liaison for the FireWise USA program. I'm in charge of the Community Wildfire Protection Program for the organization as well. I manage some primary federal grant programs also, so I'm involved in most everything that the organization does in order to promote fire-resilient landscapes and fire-adapted communities. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan. And Sarah.
I'm Sarah Thorstensen. I'm the Executive Director of the Summit Realtors, which represents 700 realtors in Summit, Park, and Lake counties, and also the Colorado Association of Realtors, which represents 26,000 realtors across the state of Colorado and all property owners across the state. We also manage the Colorado Project Wildfire Program.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And last but certainly not least, Tracy.
Hi, my name is Tracy Garceau. I'm the lead analyst for the division's Property and Casualty Consumer Services section. Me and a group of dedicated analysts assist consumers with insurance concerns. We often come in after a claim has happened or a loss has occurred. So this is really great to participate in education on how to avoid those. And we're also here for any questions you may have regarding your policy or any other insurance issues.
Thanks, Tracy. So Dan Gorham, the first question is going to go to you. And I've actually traveled the state after fires have hit communities, and I've seen the impacts of the homes and the communities that actually mitigate around them. But it can also be somewhat of an overwhelming task for consumers, for Coloradans to start the process. And I know you spent the significant portion of your presentation talking about mitigation and what folks need to do and be thinking about as they mitigate. But I wanted to go back and kind of start with that first piece. What's the first thing? What are the first steps that Coloradans should be thinking about as they start to go down the path of mitigating around their property?
Yeah, and to expand on that, we need to recognize that there is no guarantee, there is no such thing as a fireproof home, but there are things that we can do that we know will reduce the vulnerability and reduce the risk. And this is where we go with the start with here. And this includes looking up and looking at your roof. First, looking to see if you have a fire-rated roof. And if you don't, prioritize making that a fire-rated roof and replacing it if need be. The second would be to look at the ground, that immediate zone, that 5-foot zone all the way around the structure. If you have vegetation there, if you have a garden and potentially combustible mulch, prioritizing replacing that and keeping that clear so that way embers that do land there don't have anything to ignite. When we talk about embers, there's the potential that they enter into the home, and oftentimes that can be through vents. And so an easy mitigation here would be to, on all vents, make sure you have at least a 1/8-inch mesh screen, which would prevent the larger embers from entering in. And then finally, when you talk about the deck and similar to that, 5-foot non-combustible zone around the perimeter of the home, making sure that that's clear and not used as an area of storage, because if fire does get underneath there, it can pose a threat to the home. But again, just a reminder that there is no one option or no one fix. It really is a systems approach. And when we're talking about a community, it's not just one structure. You need to be kind to your neighbor, and you need to be doing things to reduce your risk and also reducing theirs.
Thanks, Dan. And I want to stick with you for 1 minute and go back to your presentation. You talked about fire season. And I know fire season is really year round, but as folks are thinking about mitigating their property, especially folks that have just newly moved into a WUI, what is that kind of wildfire season that we typically think about? When does it start? When do people really need to be thinking about getting their property mitigated?
Sure, and you're right. The idea of a season may be something of the past. That the continuation of the risk, and as things change, that timeline is changing. But for Coloradans, I would suggest as soon as you start to see the snow melting, think about going outside, and once you've taken off or put away your snow shovels, think about clearing out debris and clearing off your roof and clearing in your gutters. And then as the spring months start coming, you think about what you might be doing around the garden area and kind of approaching outwards. This might be a time to do some of those home repairs. But again, just to kind of circle back to the idea that the eternal vigilance is really important here. So while you may be doing larger projects at certain times of years when the weather is more conducive, and particularly when fire season is upon us and active fires are going on, continuously reviewing and maintaining your property on and around the building is really critical for reducing your risk.
Thanks, Dan. So now we're going to turn to the other Dan Beveridge, and really kind of jump off from what Dan Gorham was just talking about there, Dan. So when we're talking about mitigation, are we talking about homeowners needing to clear cut around their homes for 50 or 100 yards? What does it mean to have defensible space? Help frame that out for folks. Help folks think about what they need to be doing.
Thanks, Commissioner. It's a very good question that does come up rather frequently is what is sufficient mitigation when it comes to vegetation management. And it's an excellent question that comes up often for very good reasons, but an important thing to recognize is there's no one size fits all approach. There's such a broad variety of different types of fuel, or, also known as vegetation, whether it's grass, shrubs, timber litter, the list goes on. But realistically, there's no expectation that any of that vegetation is clear cut from the edge of a property to 50 yards out, 100 yards out, anything along those lines. When it comes to this concept of defensible space in the home ignition zone, one of the reasons why we utilize this term of the home ignition zone is because it allows us to address both topics simultaneously, that of structural ignitability and defensible space, which is the vegetation management component. And it's helpful for us to include those concepts because one is not necessarily more important than the other. They're most effective when they're addressed together. I want to echo many of the comments that Daniel had brought in. First off, most recently, he mentioned that mitigation efforts are not something that can be done once and then be completely done and over with. It's something that needs to be revisited all throughout the year. Spring cleaning is a very good time to do that kind of thing. But when we talk about defensible space, we generally section out distances from the property itself. 0 to 5 foot, as Daniel had mentioned, is a non-combustible zone, is what we encourage people to have. Virtually no burnable material, whether vegetation or man-made products. From 5 to 30 feet, it's an area of fuel reduction, essentially. And then from 30 feet to 100 feet, less so. So realistically, we are really looking at discontinuous fuels. From a wildland firefighter's perspective, that's really how we put fires out. And from a physical scientist perspective, like Daniel's, anytime we have discontinuous fuels, fire can't sustain itself. So this concept of defensible space is reducing the amount of fuels that we have available, because when that's done, fire cannot burn as actively or as intensely as it would otherwise. Therefore, it cannot produce as many embers, and it cannot impact a home if it was not affected otherwise.
Thanks, Dan. So now we're going to turn to Carol Walker and Tracy Garceau to talk about wildfire-prone areas and the fact that when folks live in wildfire-prone areas, they're obviously very concerned about their insurance risk and their insurance premiums and the availability of insurance. So Carol, we'll start with you. But so how does wildfire risk and mitigation affect a person's insurance?
Thanks, Commissioner. As the Colorado State Forest Service pointed out, with over half of our population in Colorado estimated to live in what we consider a high-risk wildfire area, insurance is a huge piece of that. For those homeowners, we've heard from them that they are afraid. They're afraid about availability of insurance. Will I be able to renew my insurance? There's also a real lack of understanding with most property owners of how their wildfire risk affects that insurance, and what type of coverages they need, what the expectations are from the insurance industry. And then from an affordability standpoint, how much is my insurance going to cost? If you live in a high-risk wildfire area, the reality is that you will pay more for that risk. But many homeowners don't understand that there's a variety of risk factors that their insurance company is looking at. We're in Hail Alley. Hail is our most expensive insured catastrophe, although the threat of wildfire, as we well know and we've seen played out, is growing and escalating. What we're trying to get the message out to folks is that wildfire is a risk. We know that from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and that science is something that we can greatly reduce the odds of your home burning down if you take the scientifically proven steps to protect your property. So with insurance over the last decade and how insurers view that risk, they are really asking that homeowner to share the risk. We're asking them to take those mitigation steps. More and more homeowners know this. They're getting notifications from their insurance company that they have to do A, B, C, D, and E to get and keep that insurance. And we try to give them the science, the tools to be able to do that, and really rely on our government partners and IBHS to do that as well. But homeowners, I think the good news for them with wildfire risk, a little bit different from hurricane, although you can retrofit, and earthquake, is the science shows us there are things you can do to protect your property, to keep that insurance and keep it more affordable. If you don't take that step, the reality is it's going to put your insurance at risk. So that's why we're working so hard with these partners, with this video, really to get the message to folks is be talking and communicating with your insurance company when they're asking you to take those mitigation steps, that you need to work with fire officials, the State Forest Service, the community programs they have in place to do that. And in many cases in Colorado, a little bit different from what we're seeing in California, we're finding that people can get the insurance. They may have to shop more for it. You might not be able to stay with that same preferred insurer if you're not close to quality fire protection. You don't have an access road that an emergency vehicle can get down, turn around. What is your slope? The insurance company is looking at all of those factors. But what we're finding is you might have to shop more for it. Depending on your risk, you might have to go to a higher risk insurance in this current environment. But have that communication, and if you're willing to do that mitigation, we're trying to give tools and resources to folks to do it in Colorado, you can get and keep that insurance.
Thanks, Carol. So Tracy, turning to you, what kind of advice do we give to consumers when we get the phone calls from consumers asking about those topics that Carol really touched on, that they're struggling with their insurance premiums or they're struggling with the availability of insurance? What kind of advice do you give them?
Well, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Carol. Absolutely. So we get those calls. Premiums are increasing. We live in a beautiful state, but we pay that price in many ways. And premiums, because we share the risk, are one of them. We continually suggest that they work with their insurers. Pay attention to what policy you purchased. Watch for any communications from your insurer, and pay attention. So too often we'll get a call, a week before the policy is set to renew, and they haven't done the mitigation that the company is asking them to do. So please watch for the communications. And no, most companies are not going to ask you to remove every single tree. Just as we've talked about today, there are ways to mitigate your home, and you can still enjoy living in Colorado. So again, be aware of what you've purchased, and watch for communications from your company. And then if you do find yourself looking for insurance, we have those resources to help you. So contact us and we can get you into, we have some resources that we can point you to that can help you find insurance that will suit your risk.
Great, thanks, Tracy. So Sarah, turning to you. Obviously, Colorado continues to be a very popular state to both move to and move around in. And people, because of the pandemic, tend to be moving actually into some more wildfire prone areas, more of our resort areas. There was an article today about the fact that the resort areas around Colorado are filling up with people because everybody is virtual, just like we are with this video today. So, but how does mitigation, when people are buying or selling a home in the WUI in particular, or any place where there's wildfire risk, how does mitigation impact the price of a home, and anything else you want to share with us today on those topics?
As the visibility of the issues continue to grow and increase, as you say, people are moving into our wooded areas, into the WUI. They want to live here. So what we're doing is we're seeing that realtors are putting in their remarks in listings where they are promoting the fact that a property does have defensible space as something appealing to a property. People don't have to worry about it when they buy the property. It's already done. The other thing is that realtors are now talking to their clients about a property. They show someone a property that they're really interested in, but it's heavily wooded. And they are starting to say now, well, hey, you know what? You need to probably do some mitigation on this property when you buy it. We, a couple years ago, did a defensible space on a property where the owners bought the house, couldn't afford to do the mitigation, and they agreed that they would every year cut down a couple of trees because that's what they could afford. So the conversations are happening, and that conversation happened because the realtor engaged them. The other thing is that realtors, we are offering a wildfire education class to realtors to educate them on wildfire, defensible space, everything that has been discussed today, so that realtors can have those conversations with their clients and have a good, so that they have a good understanding of what they're buying when they buy a home in the WUI and what they need to do. And it is a responsibility.
Thanks, Sarah. So Carol, I'm going to go back to you with my next question. So when we're talking about resources, and Sarah just talked about these, and I think we've talked about them a little bit throughout, but I want to make sure that we're really highlighting this for folks. When we're talking about resources for homeowners to learn more about wildfire risk, protecting their property, and insured preparedness, what are some good resources? Where do you think folks should turn?
Well, I think that key is that people have the tools that they need to be able to understand their risk and then what they need to do about it. We work closely with the Colorado Association of Realtors. And one of the reasons we have that partnership and that campaign with their Project Wildfire is because that touch point of when they're talking to their realtor, when they're talking to their insurance agent, that's when they're caring the most about it. Absolutely safety first. They should be taking those steps to protect themselves and their family and their property, but they're also protecting their personal finances. We understand that insurance is a financial incentive to do the right thing, to buy and sell a home with that wildfire risk and mitigating it is an opportunity to talk to them about insuring and selling that home. So the resources that we put together along with all of the government partners on this video and the Colorado Association of Realtors is we actually have a Colorado insurance and preparedness guide. And the goal with that is it really has a double track, is protect your property, all the things that the fire officials and the State Forest Service is telling you to do and IBHS, but then protect your personal finances. We all know that people tell me all the time, I don't even think about my insurance until I go to file a claim. That's the absolute wrong time to be thinking about your insurance. You need to be thinking about this when you can take those mitigation steps. And then when you're talking to your insurance professional about doing that annual insurance checkup. Do I have the right coverages in place? What are my deductibles? What kind of mitigation do I need to do to get and keep affordable insurance? Am I doing a home inventory? Long before you're in the path of the fire is documenting all your personal possessions so you have that documentation if that unthinkable does happen. What's covered, what isn't covered? We always know the second disaster after a wildfire, and we're facing that now, especially with our mountain fires, is flood. Flood is excluded from a standard homeowner's insurance policy, renter's policy, business policy. So be thinking about that separate flood coverage and buying that through the National Flood Insurance Program. So there's a lot of resources. We're going to link with this video to our preparedness guide, our different websites. I think that's why the partnerships are so critical, because we're not just arming them with information, we're arming them with tools on how to do it.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'm glad you brought up the flood risk after fires in particular, because the flood risk stays with communities for a long period of time, 3 to 5 years at the very least. And can you talk about for folks, just so they have the information, briefly talk about how long it takes to actually get flood insurance placed? It's not something that you can just call and have necessarily the next day. So folks need to plan ahead accordingly. So can you talk about that a little bit, please?
People need to understand, first off, it's not covered under any standard policy. Their best bet is there's a great federal website through FEMA, the National Flood Insurance Program, called floodsmart.gov, and we can link to that. That will give you all the ins and outs of flood insurance, and in your community, how you can, in most cases, purchase it from your own insurance professional. But you do need to have it 30 days in advance of those rising floodwaters. There is a moratorium on it, so you can't just run out and buy it when the floodwaters are rising and moving your way. So you really need to think about it ahead of time. And if you live in a burn scar area, you need to think about that increased risk.
That's exactly right, Carol. So especially this year, it's every year that when we have fires, but some of the fires this year have hit areas that are going to be very, very prone to flash flooding in particular. So those folks watching the video today, please be thinking about and having conversations with your insurance agent about flood insurance as soon as you possibly can. But Sarah, I want to go back to the question about resources and make sure that we give you an opportunity to talk through the resources that you all have available for folks.
Sure, and I would just say, to follow up on what Carol said, all of the organizations that Carol recommended partnering with and uses resources are excellent resources. But truly, the best way to engage on wildfire mitigation is to contact your local fire departments. Talk to them about the fact that you want to mitigate your property. And they have people that will come out to your property and give you a free defensible space evaluation. This is the best step that any homeowner or property owner can take as a first step. And developing those partnerships with other local organizations who know the area, know what needs to be done, and do have those community wildfire protection plans in place so that they can address the concerns that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Sarah. So Dan, I'm going to turn back to you for our last question. I'm going to start with you, Dan Beveridge. So when you're out having conversations with the community, with folks about mitigation, what have you found to be the best way to engage with homeowners to get them to understand the fire risk, which I think is fairly well understood out there, but more importantly, but maybe for this video at the very least, why mitigation is as important as we all think it is?
Thanks, Commissioner Conway. One of the most effective ways that I've found to communicate with folks like that when I'm able to visit with them in person is to utilize success stories. Realistically, particularly with fires that have happened in Colorado, but there are a lot of success stories that have happened all across the country. And unfortunately, those aren't as often highlighted by the various media sources as when there are saves or when defensible space and structural ignitability have been reduced and defensible spaces in place where we have had homes saved for that purpose. It's important for folks to recognize that firefighters can't always be there at an individual property when a fire does impact it. But realistically, getting to know the character of the community is a really important thing to understand and to be able to frame and focus the idea of modifying fuels in a way that will fit into the comfort level of the folks that are living in the particular part of the state in which they are. One of the things that is really a valuable means of leveraging successes is utilizing fuels management projects as a demonstration site, as it were, for a specific community. I certainly appreciate that a lot of folks feel as if mitigation equals clear cutting, but to reiterate from what I had said before, that's certainly not the case. Getting to know the community, knitting the community together for the shared purpose of avoiding wildfire impacts that are negative is a really important thing to do. If I could just piggyback onto something that Sarah had mentioned just a moment ago, I just want to clarify that not every fire department within the state is capable of providing free on-site defensible space assessments or home ignition zone assessments. Some urban areas where there's only county officials that are able to provide that kind of service, they may not have the resources to do that. And that, again, is one of the reasons why partnerships are so important. So when we're talking about statewide opportunities to do this, not necessarily every individual that lives in a rural portion of a certain county will have a volunteer department that is capable of coming out to provide that service. So it's necessary for those folks that live in those areas to ensure that they reach out to their local state forest service field office or to their county emergency managers. If nothing else, our state forest service personnel can direct you to the right people that can come out to your property and provide you with the support necessary for that purpose. And again, to reiterate another thing that Sarah said, and Carol as well, there's numerous invaluable online resources, but realistically, the best thing for any individual that wants to know what they can do to protect their home is to have a subject matter expert, a wildfire mitigation program specialist, somebody that knows about fire, knows about structures, and knows about vegetation management to come out and have a conversation with them. So it varies from one side of the state to another how that can occur, but it's a really important thing to recognize. There's a lot of resources, but they do vary significantly.
Thanks, Dan. So Dan Gorham, I'll ask the same question of you. When you're out having conversations with folks, what do you think helps? What resonates the most with consumers, with Coloradans?
Yeah, and I'll echo some of the points that Daniel just made, is the value and importance of highlighting success stories as opposed to dwelling on some of the unfortunate losses. And really the reason that is so valuable and important is because it allows us to continue the conversation and discuss that homeowners are not helpless, and there are things that they can do to reduce their risk to wildfire. And as Carol mentioned earlier, wildfire is a bit different than some other natural perils because we as humans can in fact do things at no cost, like maintaining our property and on and around our building to reduce our risk. And so that is really important, again, to highlight the success stories and remind people and show them how that they're not helpless. And then just to kind of to tie into the real purpose and motivation behind the recent Wildfire Ready release is that as a single resource, it is just a web page online that anyone can access, has all of the information distilled down, again, from decades of research and science and understanding of fire behavior that individual homeowners can take to do their property, to reduce the risk, and then hopefully become advocates and community leaders to help their neighbors do the same. Because we know that ultimately doing the risk reduction on your property is important, but it's just as important for your neighbor to reduce their risk and reduce the risk to yours.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the panel as a whole, and in particular to Mike Lester and Dan Gorham for their great presentations at the beginning. And thank you to the viewer for watching today. As Carol said, we're going to link resources to this video so folks can get easy access to the information that we talked about today. But hopefully we left you with the understanding of what mitigation is and why it's so important as we enter into the wildfire risk and the wildfire fight that we have in the decades in front of us. So thank you all again. Take care.